Hello. Good afternoon. All right, good afternoon, colleagues, and I'll just allow a few colleagues to settle down. Great. Well, the date has finally arrived. The planning behind the scenes, which took several months, has come to fruition. So welcome to one and all. I'm Himla Sudyal. I'm the Executive Officer at the Academy of Science of South Africa. Now, when I used to wear my professional hat as a human geneticist, it gave me great pleasure, and I hope to extend the same now, to welcome everyone to South Africa and to Africa, the home of the origins of our species. So, congratulations to all who have been abroad in exile and have now returned home. So we give you the gallant welcome of bringing you back to the cradle of humankind. So we're not too very far away from the actual cradle, which is a heritage site about 45 minutes to an hour's drive away from here. And for those of you who have time and can take in Sterkfontein Caves or Maropeng or the Origin Center, which are jointly run by the University of the Witwatersrand and to some extent colleagues at University of Pretoria, it is an absolute masterpiece to be able to go down this journey of our species. And so I give you the welcome that no other person has the privilege to do, and to bring you back to the land of your birth. It is also a great privilege for me, on behalf of the Academy of Science of South Africa, our council, our president should be here shortly, to welcome you to this joint event with the National Academy of Science and the International Human Rights Network. It's their 14th celebration, and we're very grateful to have had the opportunity to host jointly with them. And as you know, life hasn't been quite the normal of recent past, and so this meeting got pushed to now, a couple of years later than it was originally planned for. But nonetheless, you are here. It is so, so awesome to see people from all over the globe, and I think that's what a network is, to bring scholars together to discuss issues of relevance, of passion, and for us to set a legacy for generations to come, because I think the program that we have jointly put together is apt for the current things going on around the globe. But to kick us off today, I just wanted to do a short welcome, but in fact, our young or early career scientists are going to lead us in a discussion. These are the leaders of the future, and you will note how passionate and resourceful they are to set the scene for us in the discussion on the role of national academies and universities in promoting human rights and enhancing equity. And there isn't a better person from our local team to take the role of moderator for this session, and she's none other than Professor Catherine Burns, a good friend and colleague from the University of the Witwatersrand. Catherine is an associate professor of medical history, and she is passionate on several issues. One that I've recently worked closely with her on is the Future Professors Program, where she plays a critical role in championing and steering early career scientists to achieve their goals and objectives. Colleagues, there are little synopsis of panelists, etc., so I'm not going to go ahead and read it. You can do that at your leisure. But all I want to say is welcome to you all. Welcome to Catherine, who's going to take over from me now, and to the panel. And please, this is going to be a very interactive meeting, so whenever you feel that you need to participate during the discussions, please show your hand and the moderator will invite you into the session. So without any further ado, welcome, and over to you, Catherine.
Well, that was such a lovely and warm welcome, and I'd like to follow up with a warm welcome of my own. I recognize some people here, and we have colleagues from all over the continent. I was happy to meet a colleague when I walked in from Tanzania. I've just been chatting to a colleague from the United States. There are people here from Latin America and from countries to the west and east of us. I feel as if we're in a quadrangle of continents and peoples. Welcome one and all. It's particularly exciting, and the Academy of Science of South Africa needs to be commended with its partners for kicking off the proceedings of the next 2 days with a focus on up-and-coming young scholars. Not only young necessarily in age, but in their approach to research and science and in their approach to this important topic around human rights. Imagine for a minute that we had in fact met 2 years ago or before the pandemic. The world feels even more connected now than it did then, both for good, and I think you will all join with me in agreeing, for sad reasons. We've learned so much about our common humanity in the last 2.5 years, how a particular zoonotic pandemic can affect every single person in this room, shape every economy in the world, and bring science and humanity to the very edge of itself. Sadly, though, in the wake of this pandemic, we continue to face the scourges of war, of misunderstandings between people in different groups of the world, the collapse of infrastructure in the wake of the huge impact on our economies, and a great number of ecological, scientific, climate, and humanitarian crises. So perhaps this is a very good moment to take a pause and consider what the world of learning, scholarship, free thought, and science has to bear on the matter. It is not as if any of us can divorce ourselves from the institutions from which we come, the citizenship that we have in our own nation states or in the global arena, the obligations that we have to one another, or our ties to the past. We're very close to the capital city of this country, which was also born into an enormous amount of pain and injustice just 113 years ago. We're a couple of kilometers away, it's true, from the cradle of all humankind that Professor Sudlial gestured towards. But we're also very close to the capital of a particular kind of colonial imperial enterprise in 1910, which we now repudiate and which we have moved away from. But we live in the ramifications of that structural injustice and the story of British and other kinds of colonial power in this region, and the enormous suffering and struggle of the indigenous people of this region as well. So we really are in a very complex, interesting, imbricated space as we take up the challenge today. In times when the role of science in society is more debated maybe than ever, and very polarized, politicized, and often taken up in very partial terms, I suppose it is very heavy upon us to ask, what is the role for human rights to science and rights-based approaches? The right to science itself remains poorly understood and neglected both in national and global human rights processes. Beyond defending the freedom of scientific expression, which all of our entities are committed to here today, upholding the right to science and scientific inquiry is arguably fundamental to resolving a number of very important issues. Key sustainability challenges of our planet and of our times, from climate change and the biodiversity crisis to global health and pandemic preparedness. The right to food security, the right to clean water, the right to health, the right to education, the right to safety. As we all know, the global COVID-19 pandemic has revealed persistent global inequalities, not least in terms, my colleagues, of how the privatization of science and also medical science and pharmaceutical discovery and the current intellectual property regimes hinder sometimes just and equitable responses to access science and its benefits. In the last couple of months, no one in this room will be ignorant of the huge scientific debate that we are enmeshed in around the role of artificial intelligence and the algorithm-driven capacities and terrors that await us. This prompts the need for a shift from single-issue approaches to comprehensive and systematic treatment of the right to science and the right to scientific inquiry as a connection to, umbilically tied to, a bundle of human rights articulations across multiple arenas to counter fragmentation and the breaking up of our intellectual capital into subgroups and silos. It's really extraordinary then that we have before us today 4 people from different points of the globe. 3 of them are South African born, 1 born in the United States, all of them global in their thinking and outreach. On the one hand, we have a person come to us today, Mzukizi. He is a professor and dean at the University of Fort Hare, one of the most important and distinguished universities on the continent. He comes to us from an experience and exposure in several other South African universities. He's passionate about the role of information in society. He has spent a considerable amount of his scholarship time in the last decade trying to understand the role of the Fourth Industrial Revolution in the education of youth and as a bulwark against the diminution of youth participation in society. In other words, the intersection of law, information technology, and human rights. He's also very involved in the young South African Academy of Scientists cohort, and he is part of developing a whole new curriculum for the study of law in relation to these subjects in South Africa. We are delighted to have Michael here. In his own life as a computational scientist and engineer, he has worked on sustainability and written over 100 papers on the subject himself. But he describes himself not only as a scientist and an advocate for the institution that he represents, but as also an educational advocate. And in that order, scientist, educationist, and advocate. And he brings a wealth of experience from the United States and his time appreciating the scientific communities that he regards as his peers in the world. Mxolisi is a philosopher scholar. Welcome to you as well. He is also a lieutenant colonel in the South African National Defence Force, but he comes here today wearing civilian clothes and his hat on with a fairly recently completed substantial PhD, which you can find online, a fascinating study of the South African National Defence Force and the struggles that it faces inside of itself. In a sense, he's here as a scientist philosopher regarding issues such as trust, criminality, legibility, and nation building from inside of one of the most important national institutions in South Africa. He's also spent a considerable amount of time in other countries in the subcontinent, including about a decade ago in the Democratic Republic of Congo, working on behalf of the UN and its protection forces. And so it's also fascinating that sitting here today, kind of bookending the 2 females in the panel, is our colleague Martha. She's part of the Future Professors program at the University of Johannesburg and a rising professor like the others as well. She's an international humanitarian and human rights lawyer. It's very unusual in our country to have a woman in this field, which I think is the exact opposite in the United States and other parts of the world, such as Eastern Europe. She has spent a great deal of her life moving across the South African region, and she's an expert in Mozambique. She spends a lot of her time building curriculum and developing findings and research interventions in her own particular field, which is actually around peace. But she spends a lot of her time actually addressing military institutions with the latest discoveries that bring together science, the law of contract, the law of international relations, and efforts at peacekeeping. And she's also offered lectures to university military academies in places in the world right now that are in terrible conflict. So you have a very distinguished panel of people here today. And this is how we're going to go. As Professor Sudlial has said, we'd really like this to be interactive and for people to ask questions. So we're going to ask each of the speakers who have short presentations of about 15 minutes to proceed in this order. But after each person has finished, and as the next person is clearing their throat to begin, we might take 1 or 2 points of clarification or questions from the floor, just to anchor it, which we'll note down, and then we will come back to them at the end when we'll have time for robust discussion. And this is the order that we're going to go in. First of all, and I'm going to use people's first names in the spirit of open scientific inquiry and equality, we've got Mxolisi presenting first. Then we have Michael, then we have Mzukizi, and then we have Martha. Over to you, Mxolisi.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you. I normally hear politicians say, all protocols observed. I don't know what it means, but Prof, allow me to say, all protocols observed. 2 weeks back, a colleague came to me and said to me, he said, are you a doctor? I said, yes. He said, do you have a PhD? I said, yes. Do you know what it means? Or do you know the definition of PhD? I said, no, I don't know. He said to me, it means permanent head damage. So it means with a PhD, your head is not so good. Your head is damaged. So, Prof, if I stumble here, you must understand that I have a PhD. Thank you very much, colleagues. My presentation will not be that long. I want to talk about the effects of the energy crisis in South Africa on human rights. It has got a number of adverse effects on our human rights. That's what I'm going to talk about today. Let me see if this is going to help me. Wonderful. So I am here representing an association called South African Association of PhDs. It is a young organization that is still growing. We accept PhD holders. If you have a PhD, whether you're a prof or a doctor, please do join us. The reason why we formed this organization is that we want to create a platform and a vibrant ecosystem that brings together both academic PhDs and doctorate professionals from various universities, industries, and government parastatals. Why do we bring together all these academics? We want to be able to network and share ideas, drive causes that uplift our community and bring about impactful changes. That's what we are striving towards. We are launching this organization in October this year, God willing. We want that in the next future, we should invite some of you in a conference of this magnitude as the South African Association of PhDs, and that will happen. Colleagues, I said I'm going to talk about human rights. I'm not going to dwell too much on them, but I realize that sometimes we take things for granted that everyone knows about human rights, but there are those people who are not aware of their rights. And even if their rights are violated, they don't know what to defend because they don't know their own rights. So here I'm talking about human rights. I said human rights is a fundamental right that must be enjoyed by all of us. And no one has got the right to take that right away from us. As somebody said to me, yes, nobody's got the right to take that right away from us, but what do you say where we talk about a life sentence or a death sentence? Let me put it that way. Right to life versus a death sentence, because it means somebody can take that right away from you. It's a debate for another day. But we are here to engage and have meaningful discussions. I want to talk about, let me try and press here. Oh, it works. Human rights are interrelated. It means human rights, they coexist. You cannot enjoy the right to life and not enjoy the right to a safe environment. Hence, we are saying human rights are interrelated. I'm not going to dwell too much on this. These are the rights I'm talking about. But now I want to come to a question here. Because I said I'm going to talk about the energy crisis. The question is access to energy, in simple terms, I would use the word electricity, a human right? Yeah, yes, yeah, no. That's fine. The international, if you look at domestic law and international law, research shows that there is no law that prescribes right or access to electricity or energy as a human right. There is no law. However, under international law, there is a part that talks about access to clean and efficient energy. Why is it not a human right? Somehow I think we need to engage further so that maybe it should be a human right. And that is based on the effect it has on the human rights. You have a right, or you have freedom of movement. That means you can move the way you want, at any time. Now, at night you have load shedding. Can you move? The answer is no. If you move at your own peril. That right is now limited just because of the crisis of electricity. Last month, the Minister of Police released the last quarter crime statistics. And they were appalling, and to realize that we had so much crime, and most of this crime happens during load shedding, where there's no power. And I'm glad to say South Africans are very good people. We've adapted to this crisis such that every day we look for load shedding schedules so that we prepare ourselves. One of those days where we will toy and protest, say, you want electricity? But now we no longer do that. We look at the schedule, oh, okay, I can cook from 2 to 3. And thereafter, the power is gone. So those are the adverse effects of load shedding towards the people of South Africa. There are so many that I can mention. The economy is not thriving because of companies are shutting down their doors. People are losing their jobs. Unemployment, it's around 30-something% because of load shedding. And not so long, we had the pandemic. So after the pandemic, now there's another crisis. So it's crisis after another. So many things I can mention. Food prices skyrocketing. Access to water. How do we get water? Because there's no power. The pumps cannot pump water into our houses. So these are the things that are affecting our lives. But we are saying electricity or energy is not a human right. I think we need to sit down and rethink this whole thing. Maybe 20 years ago it was not. But now looking at the damage that it caused and how dependent we are on electricity, we can barely function. It's like we are robots ourselves because we need power to function. But how can we make sure that we promote our very own human rights? Bearing in mind that the crisis is there, but how do we promote our human rights? Let's look at the issue of the electricity. One may say, we have national academies, and they have engineers, electrical engineers. Why do we still have this problem? Why are they not engaging the government? Or why are they not engaging the state or ESCOM through the Minister of Electricity? We have a new minister, by the way, Minister of Electricity. He's working on this problem. We are hoping that in the near future, it will be a thing of the past. But currently, we have engineers, we have electrical engineers. Why are they not engaging? Sometimes you engage from an advisory point of view. You can only give advice. And an advice It's not a decision. So it's up to the person you're talking to whether he wants to listen to you and take your advice or not. I think these are some of the problems that you are facing. I think it is also imperative that national academies, wherever they are, they must learn to work independently, not to depend on the state. Because once you depend on the state, there could be some compromise there. I'm talking now basically on human rights. There's a place called Emalahleni. It used to be called Wheatbank. It's in the Mpumalanga province. If you go there now in winter, at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you won't be able to see maybe 5 meters from you because of the way that area is so, I don't know, the air is so polluted. There are coal mines around that area. And people who are staying in Wheatbank and Mikkelbeck, they are close to each other. They use coal to heat up their homes, to cook, and so on and so forth. And my point is here, coal is good. We need coal. But at some point, I said, the national law said we need clean and efficient energy. Is that clean? And what are we doing? What is the state doing to make sure that those people have electricity so that they can do away with the coal stoves? The old stove called Jewel and Welcome Dover. I want to talk about equality. We talk about equality most of the time. Are we really equal before the law? Can we really say we are equal before the law? The story of equality reminds me of the old story of a book written by George Orwell. Talks about the animal farm. It says all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. I am not saying we are animals, because I know when you talk about human rights and you say animals, you said we are animals. I never said that. But I'm just saying this because he said this because of the disparities that exist within society. Whether we like it or not, we cannot be equal. But the law says we are equal. Equal in what way? There are areas in South Africa that are affected by load shedding more than others. More than others. There are areas in South Africa that never had load shedding, never had energy crisis. Why? Are they not South Africans? Are they not paying tax? So equality, it's a very intricate situation. But as national academies, what do we do to ensure that we enhance equality within our spaces? There are so many things that we can do. We need to start occupying the media space because our voices are not loud enough. Every time I watch TV, I see one of the same analysts. Where are we? We also encourage our members from our association that they must join, they must actually be board members. ESCOM, we need a member there or two, so that whenever they raise issues, they are there, part of the board, their voices will be heard. Because currently, we are shouting, but we're shouting from outside the building. And people inside the building are playing loud music, can't even hear us. So those are the problems that we are facing. We need to claim that space. We need to talk about human rights. We need to talk about human rights abuse, human rights violations. We need to be like, I like what lawyers do normally. They've got an association of lawyers. And that association, what they do, they use words like pro bono. Whenever they see a situation, they are there, free of charge. We need to learn to move beyond talking, but taking actions. Like the issue of electricity. We are talking about it, but we're not taking actions to address the situation. I'm told my time is up and I was just heating up. But the lady said to me, no. Wrap up. Colleagues, Some of us are not invited to such events, so we're not invited to get excited, want to talk too much. So, but unfortunately, time is not on my side. But I think as I go back to my seat, we will engage meaningfully in this subject, because human rights are very important and must be protected. Otherwise, if your rights are not protected, your dignity is gone. Colleagues, Prof, I thank you.
As Michael is getting himself ready to come in and put his points forward, I think you really have warmed up the baton, perhaps with some solar energy from inside of yourself. And I think some of your examples, particularly about how night falls nearby and the human beings that live and work in areas of coal production have got a very different quality of air to those of us sitting in the room now. I think we could find examples of that across the whole globe, from China to the United States to neighboring countries. So thank you for those thoughts. And Michael, are you ready to take over the hot seat?
Thank you. I'm very excited to be able to present here. So I'm going to begin by talking about which group I am representing here. So I'm a member of the National Academies New Voices program, which is a relatively young program. We're on our second two-year cohort that's designed to bring together early to mid-career scientists from across the U.S. to discuss global issues and provide alternative viewpoints to complement the expertise of the senior scientists of the National Academies. And this is a group that's chosen for multiple forms of diversity, not just diversity of backgrounds and fields, but geographic diversity and diversity of career tracks between science, policy, and advocacy. And these viewpoints I will present are a synthesis of our viewpoints. I want to emphasize that these are not the official views of the National Academies, the employers of our members, or of the Moore Foundation, which sponsors us. So I'm going to begin by talking about three trends within the U.S. that are impacting science and human rights. The first trend is that trust in science has declined significantly in recent years as part of a decline in trust from all institutions. So this data is from the Pew Institution, or Pew Foundation, and we'll see, if you're looking over at the left, that the number of people in the general public who will say they have a fair amount or a great deal of confidence in medical scientists has declined by 11% in the past 3 years. With scientists in general, it's about a 10% drop. And you'll see this drop across a number of fields. And the good news is that you're still better off at parties telling people that you're a scientist instead of a politician, but you're not as trusted as you were several years ago. The second trend is that we are in the middle of a re-examination of how racial and other minority groups are treated by U.S. institutions in a range of areas, and this includes science. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the response in the U.S. to George Floyd's death, which led to a re-examination not just of how Black Americans were treated by law enforcement, but how they're treated within education and other areas. But there's many other movements happening alongside that. So, for instance, there was a rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans in recent years, which led to increased advocacy from the Asian American community. And within COVID-19, Native American groups who often have poor access to water and health care have been increasingly advocating for their rights. And this re-examination does include and has to include science, including looking at our own history of science, how science is performed, and who has the opportunity to become scientists within the United States. The third is that we're in an environment of increasing political polarization within the United States. And this includes things such as COVID and climate, which are increasingly hot-button issues. So the figure on the right shows the gap in vaccination rates between counties within the United States that voted for Biden versus counties in the United States that voted for Trump. And you'll see about 13% gap developed in those vaccination rates, which suggests that people's political viewpoints are impacting how they see the science that affects life and death decisions. There is actually an increase in mortality rates tied to this. The other figure on the right shows what percentage of adults within the US believe that global warming is caused by humans. And you will see this actually maps strongly with political affiliations, although there's a few qualifying trends. For instance, some of the darker blue areas are where many jobs depend on fossil fuels, and even some conservative areas, such as Florida, will have people who look at climate change more seriously because of how these areas are affected by climate change. And so in light of these trends, what are the issues that are affecting science? I'm going to go through 6 issues very briefly that we within the New Voices program wanted to highlight. The first is equity and inclusion within science. And one of my colleagues pointed out that we need to think not just about how we get to diversity, but why we need diversity, because that impacts how we go about achieving it. For instance, are we just trying to simply ensure a larger pool of scientists than we would get just by having white and Asian males included in science? Are we using race as a proxy for other kinds of diversity? It's shown that diverse teams achieve better. But how are we defining diversity in that area? Are we interested in including the lived experiences of Black and other scientists within the decision-making of science? For instance, it is documented that Black scientists are going to be more interested in the healthcare problems that affect the Black community, and this actually winds up impacting the funding rates of Black scientists. And one can imagine artificial intelligence and machine learning developing very differently when minority perspectives are included. Or are we fundamentally interested in ensuring equality of opportunity within our society? These goals aren't in conflict with each other, but they're different enough that they're going to impact how one approaches diversity within science. And one of the things we're becoming increasingly aware of within the United States is what we've historically thought of as, quote, a leaky pipeline. May not be the right model for what's happening within science. And another model has been proposed, the hostile obstacle course, where I, as a white male, had a different process to achieving and different series of obstacles I had to overcome to get to the same career achievements that a Black woman might face. And how do we remove these obstacles? And I'm going to take time to zero in on one problem of particular interest, because we have a huge diversity of educational institutions within the United States. And the 150, what we call R1s, or research-intensive universities, are only a small fraction of the 4,000 universities that educate Americans. And this 4,000 includes 107 historically Black colleges and universities. It includes 35 tribal universities and about 100 plus minority-serving institutions where more than 25% of the enrollment is underrepresented groups. How do we tie these together in a just manner to ensure equitable science? Knowing that, for instance, but when working with these schools, there's a tendency sometimes to treat these schools as feeder schools to large institutions and not having value beyond that. Sometimes inviting researchers to join collaborations in areas, for instance, in my field of sustainability, it's very clear that minority institutions should be at the table when we are talking about things like environmental justice and energy equity. However, these institutions also don't want to be limited to this field and want to be involved in fundamental science. Sometimes there's a failure to acknowledge the unique mission of these institutions. I have a map of the historically black colleges and universities in the U.S. to the right. You will see that they're heavily concentrated in areas that have a long history of racial segregation, and they had a very parallel mission to the segregated white institutions at the time that they do not want to abandon, and the black community is fiercely proud of these institutions, which, for instance, generated much of the leadership for this U.S. civil rights movement. How do we tie them into science in ways that honors their original mission? And there's always the issue of not building capacity at these schools. And many of you from the Global South may have been groaning during this presentation because it may remind you of the problems that you face in trying to collaborate with institutions in the United States. So this carries over to global collaborations because there can be a failure to include the history, culture, and physical condition of non-U.S. institutions, again, or delaying involvement until deployment and not bringing it up into the fundamental science stage, bringing in international collaborators only when necessary to check a box on the grant application, not including institutions in the development and planning stages of science, and not recognizing that scientists in all of the world want to be engaged in all areas of science. And sometimes we haven't even trained our own scientists to be able to recognize these challenges. So the third area that I'm going to pull back to is public trust in science within the United States. I mentioned this declining trust. So there are some issues. For instance, is science communicated effectively? Science barely trains for communication with other scientists. It somewhat doesn't train for communication with the public in general, and it doesn't train one to cross cultural barriers while communicating. And this may be a contributing factor here. But there's also the consideration of what a more trustworthy science looks like. Does that include greater engagement and bringing the viewpoints from the public into how we do science, or creating a more diverse pool of scientists? The fourth area of concern that we saw was decreasing academic freedom and threats to individual scientists. So 70% of scientists who've spoken publicly in the media on COVID-19 received some form of threats. And as you can see from the figure to the right, 15% of those were death threats. And we see this replicated in climate. 39% of climate scientists, even ones not communicating to the public, have been subjected to some form of cyberbullying as a result of their choice of scientific fields. And we're also seeing physicians and researchers in reproductive health, gun violence, and LGBTQ+ health targeted as well in recent years. And we're also seeing a threat to the independence of public universities. And this is taking multiple forms. Sometimes it's a push by public officials to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at exactly the time the scientific community is starting to understand their importance. It can be a weakening of tenure protections. Sometimes it can require a requirement to teach a particular perspective of history, which may eventually carry over into teaching particular perspectives of science. And it can be lack of permission for scientists and technical experts to provide expert testimony in court cases. The fifth issue that I'm going to discuss is defining human rights and impacts of climate and ensuring a just energy transition. We have to remember climate was originally treated as an ecological challenge. Let's make sure the polar bears don't go extinct. Now it's understood that the impacts on humanity are much larger, and the impacts of climate and the burdens of mitigation and adaptation within the United States, they fall increasingly on poorer and minority communities. Globally, they fall increasingly on less industrialized countries. And we need to make sure, and as we develop new energy technologies, as my colleague pointed out, energy underpins many other rights, Then, and thinking about carbon management, how do we ensure the solutions we create are equitable? And we also find that there's a large disconnect between human rights frameworks and scientific understanding of climate change. So the figure to the left highlights how vulnerable groups and climate vulnerabilities within the southeastern U.S. are often linked, and the figure to the right points out how global climate vulnerability is often concentrated in the global south. And our final issue that we realized within our group was support and solidarity of international scientists displaced by conflict and persecution. Here's 4 recent headlines from Science and Nature pointing out the conflicts issues first by Afghan scientists displaced by conflict, similar to how scientists were displaced by the Syrian civil war. The second is the ongoing challenge within Iran as scientists speak out on human rights there. And then the linked challenges, because we don't only have to think about science in Ukraine and Ukrainian scientists who are displaced, but the fact that many Russian scientists are under threat of persecution for speaking out about the implications of the war. And there's also an increasing threat to environmental activists globally. So I'm presenting these issues to spark discussion. We don't expect everybody in our audience to share to share our exact perspectives. We're here, but we're looking to get the discussion going. All right, thank you.
That was very thought-provoking as well. Thank you so much, Michael. And I'm sure that, like me, you're all making connections between the two discussions. One that comes to mind is the role of people offering what Mxolisi called pro bono work. And your point, Michael, that in fact many public institutions are fearful of their scientists or scholars speaking in the public domain for liturgical, other reasons, and also for the very real threats that you've spoken of. But let's open up to the audience for 2 questions, which we'll note and which we'll come back to later, so that you don't just feel as if you're sitting there not participating. Would anybody like to register a question for now for either one of the 2 speakers, which I'll note and we'll come back to? Please introduce yourself and take the floor. Here's a microphone coming, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Thank you for helping. Ian?
My name is Julia. I come from the National University of Mexico, from National University of Mexico. I would like to mention to Michael that don't you think that perhaps science needs more science communication? Science communicators are not necessarily scientists, and they can complete some of the issues that you have raised. That's one thing. And the other thing for you too, about trust. I agree absolutely with you that there is a crisis on trust, but could you perhaps mention a bit about the difference in misinformation and disinformation? Because one thing is that perhaps you haven't studied and you don't have the information, but there are also fake news and lies that are changing the people's opinion, like in the vaccination and all these processes that we're watching. So the trust thing and the science communicators, please, Michael.
Thank you so much for that point from the floor. Well taken. Anyone else like to raise a point before we move over to our other 2 speakers? Something you'd like to see addressed? We'll have plenty of time just now if you don't want to raise it now, right? Okay, I think that then, Ian, do you see another hand? I thought I saw the lady behind you. Okay. Mzukizi, we'd love to call you up. I'm sure that you're burning to put your points forward now, because we really are passing the baton over to your side of the room. Please come and take the mic.
Thank you, Prof. Prince, and good afternoon, colleagues. Mine is a humble attempt to examine universities and academies and their role in navigating this usually difficult question relating to human rights and equality in a society that is constantly evolving. So I just, for ease of reference, included the layout of my presentation. I'll introduce the study and then sum it up the presentation by looking at universities and how society has been shifting and and the manner in which universities have progressed in capturing the changes in society. I want to start the discussion, colleagues, by making reference to a theory that was developed by Max Weber, the sociology of intellectuals. It looks at the ability of intellectuals to engage in public matters. I said equal to sociology of professionals. But what we know about this theory is that it refuted what Weber refers to as methodological pestilence. Of course, there are those who say this was a critique of another German philosopher who was competing with Weber at the time. But the essence of methodological pestilence is that it denotes a form of scholarship that is inward-looking. We see a lot of that, colleagues, particularly given the huge incentives that are provided by to universities, and universities by extension provides to academics. He then continues to say this scholarship is all about self-preservation, and it has no regard to advancing society or issues relating to social advancement. And then he recommends that perhaps we have to look at methodological nominalism as an alternative. We look at developing a form of scholarship that substantively engages in social problems. That's number one. Discover the problems, that's number two, and also provides mechanisms, or solutions on how the problems, can be addressed for the future generation. And there has to be regard to community progression. I'm going to argue later about universities and their place. But what I want to say, colleagues, I've just indicated some of the theories that flow from the sociology of intellectuals. One is saying intellectuals are class in themselves, and therefore it's difficult to separate academics from society. The other one looks at intellectuals as classless, and the third one, intellectuals as class-based. But where I want us to zoom into is where is the place of universities in all of this? Universities are social constructs. I want to make an argument. Their determination is geared towards scientific processes, necessitating the need for applying and developing knowledge. We see some of the examples when we look at the pyramids of Egypt, the studies that flow from the pyramids of Egypt, all the way to the kingdom of Timbuktu, where academics came together and formed what they referred to as the community of scholars. Therefore, universities have a role to play, and that role has to be underpinned by the values that guides academic processes. Those are scientific improvements, economic progression, and social advancement. Earlier, I talked about education in a constantly developing society. I want to make an argument to say, if we examine the emergence of the first industrial revolution, universities provided solutions on how society should cover, right? Should take advantage rather of the benefits of the industrial revolution at the time, and also alleviate some of the challenges that emanate from the revolution. So the universities had to adapt their scholarship to ensure that society is provided with the solutions that are necessary, to take advantage of the opportunities provided by the revolution. That's the question that we have today. How are universities and academies going to respond, or are responding, to the fourth industrial revolution? the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution makes it patent clear that we have to take this Fourth Industrial Revolution as a revolution. In any revolution, there are victims, as well as those who benefit from the revolution. Therefore, we have to alleviate the burden that the revolution will have or will translate into to the victims, and also improve ways in which society will be able to take advantage of the benefits. Now, let's look at universities and human rights. I want to start the discussion by making reference to a quote: "The future of a country doesn't depend on its wealth, but on its education." We know that the right to education in South Africa, within the South African context, is constitutionally entrenched in Section 29 of the Constitution. But I want colleagues to take a look at the picture on the right. The question that I want us to ask ourselves is, what should academies and universities do in situations such as this? We know that the future of education determines the future of a country. Should we fold our hands? We know that throughout the evolution of scholarship, universities have tended to take advantage of the developments in society, or not to detach themselves of society. I know that universities have shared goals or shared social goals. They look at the injustice, and those ones: social injustice, racial injustice, gender injustice, amongst other things. Universities are not inseparable to what in Greek etymology is referred to as the polis, to a city or a country. Therefore, they have to engage in the social problems that society is currently facing. As far back as 1933, Cohen developed what he referred to as the social problems that existed then in 1933. But I want to argue that these social problems are currently facing education as we speak. Scholarship, academies and universities are grappling with their legitimacy in the eyes of students. Prof did enunciate further. Legitimacy in the eyes of the community, and legitimacy in the eyes of the often powerful donors. Now, let's look at the academies and human rights. I won't delve much here, but when I was preparing the presentation, I wanted to understand, what does the future hold for universities and academies? We know what happened here, right? And we can argue in some corners that methodological pestilence was evident in this case. But I don't want us to talk about it. Where I want us to talk about, are we ready to actually respond to future consternations that are facing society? Professor Benz, there is a scholar in America, Prof you'll know, Rita McGrath. She's a business strategist and a professor at Columbia University. He authored a book, Seeing Around Corners. She says that the snow melts in the edges. Let's contextualize this a little bit. We often are accused as scholars of operating in the ivory towers. And the supposition, therefore, is that we are not in touch with reality on the ground. That's why we some of us who grew up in the science academies appreciates the role that SciAS is playing, appreciates the role that ASSAf is playing in ensuring that the gap between society and scholarship is closed as far as possible. Because society, that's where the snow is melting. That's where the problems are. And scholarship has to respond to the challenges that are facing society. Now, we talk about human rights. We talk about equality. I want to say that if we are to succeed in responding in an assiduous manner to human rights and scholarship, we have to invoke justice. I know that for lawyers, the Constitutional Court, which operates in Braamfontein, has been pivotal in developing jurisprudence on justice, not law, on justice. Of course, there are attributes about justice, but the one that I want to talk about, for example, the sword and so forth, but the one that I want to talk about is the blindfold. Justice does not see. And by the way, the notion of justice is traceable from the preamble to the Constitution of South Africa. So, but essentially, what is needed in our view is methodological nominalist universities, where scholarship is just and impartial, where we develop science or knowledge that is free of influence, that we look at unbiased judgments, not be swayed by richness or poverty, power or weakness. We look at the merits and then make judgments. But if you talk about knowledge, whose knowledge is it? Whose knowledge is this? I often get into discussions or sometimes arguments with my academics in the faculty, where they say students are the stakeholders. I say, no. We exist in this faculty because we are in the service of students. And when students leave our faculty, then I continue, they become part of community. So whatever we do is towards the upliftment of society. So I want us to have a discussion. Is the knowledge that we're talking about to improve student lives only? Is the knowledge that scholarship has to bring about and develop geared towards accelerating growth and development? Is the knowledge to suit the most powerful donors? Or the answer is all of the above? Thank you very much.
The seat is getting hotter and the provocations are getting more complex and deep. Without any further ado, can I call Martha up to address us, and then we'll take some questions to the two of them and then open up. Thank you so much.
Good day. I would like to thank the organizers, ASSAf, for this opportunity, and also to the Future Professors program for nominating me to participate today. My target audience today includes specifically the early career scholars that I see some of you present here, such as myself, and to talk to the important project that binds all of us, which is the Teaching and Learning Project. After all, UN SDG 4 speaks to quality education. So the topic of my presentation, and I do apologize for the seasoned teachers in the room, is facilitating international human rights education, knowing your audience and objective. And in other words, this means the who and the why we are educating, and what is the purpose of your learning engagement. I chose this topic because as academics, and I see some of the future professoriate and the current professoriate in this room, is not only research. Our research, I believe, informs our teaching, our supervision, capabilities, our teaching and learning, and our community engagement. So I want to focus on teaching in human rights law. My presentation is structured as follows. These introductory remarks. Then I will talk to how I approach teaching the same topic to my undergraduate students who's second year at the University of Johannesburg, to my LLM master students, and then finally to when I train military or NGOs. How would my approach differ based on who is my audience? First, I would like to flag that there's several cutting-edge issues that I could use as an example today. For example, you spoke about climate change and how this impacts on human rights. That is one of the topics that we address in our International Human Rights Law course. Interestingly, I will be traveling tonight to the African Union because the next 3 days we are actually discussing if Africa needs their own cyber law instrument or if we accept what is proposed from the West. I was quite surprised and impressed that they decided to include a lawyer in international armed conflict, as well as an international human rights lawyer, to look at those specific touching points in terms of cyber law. Another interesting topic could be poverty, the eradication of poverty. How does it impact human rights law? Or can we use human rights law to protect or prevent or address poverty? So these are the type of discussions that I will have with my students. The topic that I chose specifically for today is two topics that actually conflict each other. And that is, or two areas of international law, which is a bit juxtaposed. The one is international human rights law, or as I like to call it, the law of peacetime, versus my other area of speciality, the law of armed conflict. It's also known as international human rights law. So why do I choose this topic? For those of us on the African continent, we are very aware that the vast majority of armed conflict is indeed non-international in nature. You might know it as civil war, and not specifically the type of conflicts that is on CNN, BBC, and so forth, which focuses mostly on the Russian-Ukraine conflict, which is also a major issue. So these two areas of law are in stark contradiction. For example, sir, let's say you're a member of the armed forces and I am a member of the armed forces. In armed conflict, if you kill me, there's no problem, perfectly legal. If it is peacetime, it would indeed be murder. Indeed, human rights law is somewhat limited during armed conflict. The US rejects the application of human rights law during armed conflict, as well does Israel. I'm not sure about the Chinese position. I have tried to engage. In terms of the African Union, in terms of our African Charter, human rights law co-applies with the law of armed conflict, but this isn't always realistic and highly controversial. So how would I engage my students? My second-year student, who is just trying to understand definitions and actually commanding the law, versus my postgraduate students, and when I engage the military. So, in note of designing my lectures, I have to mention that I have different phases. I have the prepare phase, activities that students have to do before they come into my classroom, because my classroom is inquiry-based and we need a basis to work from, and then the contact session, and afterwards our consolidation phase, which can be quizzes, or perhaps at master's level they have to summarize high-level academic articles and then criticize each other's reflections. But in asking the question, who is my students in terms of my undergrads, they are part I'm a millennial. I've been told that frequently by my husband, who's not a millennial, and apparently I also have unique characteristics from being part of a millennial corps. But I teach mostly Generation Z. Generation Z, who are also first-generation students. For those of you who are not from my continent, it means that these are students who are the first members of their family actually going to university, right? And this also combines with our South African realities, for example, the energy crisis. So I have a unique set or audience of students, and I have to take into account that they matriculated, that's their grade 12, before they go to university, during a time of COVID-19, where they used media to study. So it's quite a big shock then to come to law school when your first year of university was during a pandemic and most of your high school education, and suddenly you have to come to my classroom. It can be quite daunting, even just to stand up and pose a question because they're so used to being stuck to their screens. So knowing that Generation Z responds well to media and that they do fare better in terms of memory retention when the delivery is chunked. I've tried to employ Powtoons, which is an educational software, to try and reduce the message or core messages and information so that it is not more than 2 to 3 minutes, because studies show that that is Gen Z's maximum retention rate, especially as they can Google information so quickly. So I would like to show how the prep phase would look for my undergraduate class. Sir, if you can press play, I will only show you 1 minute. Now I turn to my master's students. So in terms of master's student education, we want to grapple in debate and promote inquiry-based learning, and also ensure that we do get that in-depth reflection. So the type of question or my contact engagement with my master's students differ. So you will see here that I have a quote in terms of critical thinking by Robert Cole, which says, "There can no longer be any doubt. International humanitarian law, that is the law of war, and international human rights law are near relations. This oft-repeated observation must now be accepted by all. Many believe that the close relationship between these two areas existed and was perceived from the outset. That is not at all the case. Formerly assigned to separate legal categories, it was only under the persistent scrutiny of modern analysis that they revealed the common attributes which would seem to promise many fruitful exchanges in the future." And now I want my students to reflect in terms of the situation in Sudan or the situation in Ukraine, whether what Kolb said in 1998, he seemed to have think that there was a nice convergence, is still true today, especially if we look at the horrific standards in detention centers in countries where there's non-international armed conflict. So this then will hopefully spark an academic debate. Then, when I train soldiers, some of them are mostly at the commander level, but some are also young men with no legal education, hopefully above the age of 18, and they do not care about Robert Culp. Honestly, they don't even know who he is. They want to know, when can I shoot, who can I shoot, what is my rules of engagement, depending on where I am deployed. If I should even mention to them human rights law is coming in with IHL, they will be panicking. So we need clear instructions, which means that this is where our tasks come in, to see how practically we can merge these two bodies of law so as not to confuse our soldiers and rebels. Geneva called us amazing work to engage with rebels on IHL, as to where can we use human rights law, where international humanitarian law is silent, because this body of law was developed mostly after the World War II experience, and there were no real African presentation to say that, listen, our reality is civil war. It is different. And therefore, there's very limited regulations. So I'm not going to play this video. We might have 2 minutes. Okay. So maybe I will just explain to you what happens. It has this nice James Bondy music. And then I set the scene in terms of where we are in the world, which countries are involved. And this is the background story. And now you are the military advisor. Okay, it seems like they are playing. She will give me 30 seconds so that you can get the idea. Engage is that we will split the classroom into syndicates, and the soldiers have to analyze certain missions. For example, in this case, we have the situation of you are in a conflict and you have a member of the transgender community and you're detaining that person, but you only make provision for male bathrooms and male detention facilities. Does the law of armed conflict tell us anything? No. But human rights law might have the answer. And training militaries, I can tell you that I have had the unique opportunity of sharing barracks with 40 snoring men. And this was a Western European military because they did not think that how can a female be an IHL lawyer? So just imagine if you are in a situation of detention and you are transgender. So here I push the soldiers to think beyond IHL and where human rights law might have the answer. And since I might only have 30 seconds left, I would like to leave a final thought from Jonathan Jansen, who will actually be joining us later today, because my message is actually asking, who is your audience? Because you will see how the same lecture change depending on who you will be addressing. And Jonathan, in his chapter, What Does Scholarly Teaching Look Like? He's one of the mentors on the Future Professors program that is hosted by Stellenbosch. And I quote, "Scholarly teaching is rich, deep, engaging, transparent, interactive, and committed. It references acts of teaching against what is known in literature, on the one hand, and what can be observed from best practice, on the other hand. It is intellectually intensive in the planning and teaching phases of preparation, but it is also personal and engaging with the students who are present. So my message is that it is important to ask, who is your audience? And what is the purpose of the message that you want to deliver, so that we can always, in every lecture, strive towards UN SDG 4. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation as well. Just before I do about a 5-minute roundup comment, which hopefully will integrate all of the different speakers across a platform that's very divergent, can I see if there's anyone in the audience that would like to put a specific question to the last two speakers so we can record it? Yes, we have our colleague in the front, Ian, if you would bring the mic, and if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, colleague.
My name is Rosa Mines from ASSAf from Ghana. I have a question for both of them. Thank you for your presentations. And Professor Mzukisi, you can't just leave us with what happened at UCT and not tell us about it, because we don't know what happened.
Good point.
So I'll be very happy for you to let us know what happened. And to Professor Bradley, I think that, first of all, the South African reality may not be the African reality. So I think you should bear that in mind. And when you are doing the cyber security for Africa, there are some countries in Africa who have cyber security laws. So I think you should find out those countries who have. Because every time I go anywhere, I don't like Africa being used as a country. It's a continent. So as you said, who is the audience you are talking to? Because there are different levels of people and different levels of education. Thank you.
Thank you for your points of reflection, and I think we will actually return to that UCT slide. It would be very interesting. Anyone else like to raise a question or put forward a point of view that they want us to take up? Yes, we have a colleague over there. Please introduce yourself, sir.
My name is Professor Atemu Michika, Kenya National Academy of Sciences.
Welcome.
Really would like the last speaker to elaborate a little bit on the difference between the teachings to the Z generation, millennials, notwithstanding the actual syllabi approved by the University Senate.
Thank you very much. If there is no other question, that's why one other question burning, also from a gentleman from Columbia University, which we had mentioned earlier in one of the presentations. Over to you.
I wanted.
Can you just
Marty
introduce
Chelsea
us, Murray?
from Columbia University. This is to Professor Jotini. I would like to add to your. I'd like your opinion. I'd like to add to what you said about universities, because I think. Maybe because I give a talk called The Continued Importance of Useless Information, is that we have all lived through a pandemic in which useless information led to the development of RNA vaccines, and which saved millions of people. And I think there is, as we look certainly in the biological sciences, I think in all of the sciences, we see many examples where going directly to answer a problem does not solve the problem, but what you need is the underlying information that is developed by scholars. That's not always easy to sell to others. But I would contend that it's absolutely essential for progress to be made. And there's a long history of that. So I would add that to your list, and I'd sort of like your way, you to respond. Maybe I've misunderstood your talk, but that, to me, we can't always be looking for utility, because defining utility is very, very difficult, if not impossible.
Thank you so much for your contribution. I can see we have one more. Can we take this last one? Then I'll offer my humble opportunity to try and wrap up the four and some issues and stakes that have arisen, and then we'll have more opportunity. Thank you. Can you introduce yourself, ma'am?
Thank you, Prof. Benz. I'm Toza Maqobane from the Academy of Science of South Africa, a program officer for Africa and International Partnerships, but I'm also a member of the South African Young Academy of Science. My question is actually tied. I'm not sure who will answer this question, but it's relevant to both of you. It's with regards with education. So, yes, you mentioned in terms of the future, depending on the quality of education, and Martha, you mentioned SDG 4, the quality education. So my question is, with regards with education, how can we make sure that we don't just finish education cycles, but we are empowered in and through education? The reason I'm bringing this is because we have so many social ills, but specifically with gender-based violence. How can we use now education as a tool to empower both sexes, not just to say I've completed my education cycle? That is the question. And the last one is with regards to, you mentioned generations that are found at universities, but you also find different generation in our workforce. And my question is, how can we make sure, because the challenges that we're having are very complex and we use different lenses to look at them depending on which generation are you from. How can we make sure that we tap into each other's strengths irrespective of which generation, understanding that we are all from different generations? Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments and reflections. Colleagues, you will agree with me that these are four very different presentations, yet they have overlaps. And I'm sure that everyone in the room has been thinking through the course of the last hour and a bit, what is my definition of a scientist? What is my definition of a university? What is my definition of scholarship? What is independent and academically free scholarship? What is instrumental, driven by particular needs, whether they are the nation state? I think we've had the word donors mentioned a few times. We could add words industry. We could add a word that's softer, imperatives, emergencies. Some of us have an image of a citadel on a hill, of an institution called a university, which claims to universal knowledge, but is often very particularist and sometimes even nationalist, allied, as most communities of scholars originally were, to different religious affiliations, whether that be in Timbuktu or Padua or Addis Ababa or Beijing. Universities have often grown out of particularist rather than universalist soil. Even a cursory history of universities in the world that you could read in an Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia, you will soon find that universities arose in many parts of the world, and they all often claimed in common that they were professing universal truths. And yet it's only been in the last 100 years or so that universities in the West have drawn into themselves people from the majority in their own countries. Slightly longer in lineage are places like Senegal, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Not that long ago, universities in the United States, the United Kingdom, Ireland and Scotland were forerunners over what we call England in allowing the majority of people into their university space. South Africa only allowed white women to get degrees at university in the 20th century and only welcomed in as complete equals people of color and black South Africans very recently, even though some unbelievably brave and courageous people put themselves into those very complex situations as early as the 1920s with Z.K. Matthews, all the way through to people like A.B. Kluma. Charlotte Maxeke traveled to Columbia University to do a BSc. She was the first woman south of the Zambezi River to get that qualification. So while universities today often have as a credo or mission statement, whether they teach in Arabic or whether they teach in Cantonese or French or English, they claim that they are committed to universal principles of freedom, of inquiry, of testing hypotheses, and of publishing not only successful findings, but the golden standard, publishing their failures too. This is what health science journals are moving towards. This is what open source peer publishing is pushing us towards, showing your mistakes and not only your successes. We could add many other very warm human rights facing attributes that scholars and universities are striving towards: dignity, equality, respect for difference, honoring different points of view, understanding that we can all be looking at the same phenomenon, such as a mountain, but from legitimately different points of views, with therefore very different pathways to describe that particular geological entity. I thought that one slide that Michael showed us of paths to success with different obstacles in the way, even though there might be the same goal. I think you were describing, for example, your journey and the journey perhaps of an African-American scholar in your country, but with very, very different routes to the end goal. On the other hand, all of us come from societies, including myself, which have very complex histories of inclusion and exclusion in universities. The continent that we're sitting on is unbelievably diverse. We have universities on the African continent that are very ancient and ones that were only born in the last 20 years. For example, the University of Johannesburg, which grew out of a university with a very different project before. We have universities that are public-based and require almost no individual person to pay fees, and those are covered by the taxpayer. And we have universities represented by colleagues in the room that have fees upwards of $150,000 a year. So we have this enormous array on this planet of people's entry and the barriers to entry into higher education. We have societies where the Gini coefficient is very flat. There are people here from Sweden, for example, and Scandinavia, where the most wealthy people and the people with modest wealth are not very separate from one another. On the other hand, it's very difficult for other citizens from countries around the world to gain access to that space. And the wealth of those societies has often been based not only on their own exploitation of themselves, but their exploitation of the natural resources and peoples of the rest of the world. So while we might look at a country like Sweden and say, or Norway, with its enormous sovereign wealth fund, and bow at the great honor that they've achieved of dropping their Gini coefficient, but we might also regard the fact that the sale of those petrochemicals into the world market has also caused distortions and pathologies which the bodies and souls of people living far away from them carry every day. We're all interconnected. If for a moment we were to imagine Habermas and his convening of a public of common equal persons, very similar to the way that Weber did, and I acknowledge your use of his fascinating sociology of intellectual life. He argued that what a university really is it's a marketplace of communally held ideas, where people dialogically persuade one another through the back and forth between hypothesis and proof of the most reasonable outcomes to the world's problems. Every one of us, I think, are lucky enough to have been at a university or a center of higher education where there is at least some of that flourishing. Even in the darkest days of apartheid in South Africa, universities were places where people would argue and struggle with one another to the benefit of our society. Many of the first generation, I don't know what we would call the generation educated in the mission schools in the 1920s and 30s, who were leaders of, for example, the African National Congress, but we wouldn't call them millennials, Do we call them early African nationalists? Are they Generation Radio? I'm not sure. That generation that came of age and were born actually during the flu pandemic, such as Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, born in 1918, one of the only people in his family under the age of 10 who survived the flu, they went on to profoundly shape the 20th century, whether they grew up in Algeria or Morocco or the United States or Canada or India or Ghana or Tanzania or Sri Lanka or what was then the Soviet Union. And they've left us with a whole series of really important goals. Of course, as you all know, as World War II came to an end, and which we've had referenced in 3 of the talks today, we saw the emergence globally of a declaration of the human rights originally called of man, very telling, later changed to Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And fascinatingly, smaller countries like the emerging Saudi Arabia and Ghana and India played such a crucial role at that UN meeting. And an American woman who was the wife of a president, namely Eleanor Roosevelt, who famously said, "Women are like tea bags. You can only tell how strong they are when they're in really hot water." So a very complicated and fascinating group of people drew up that charter. And it's only one part of that charter that addresses academic freedom. Only one part of that charter that addresses knowledge and science. And what fascinates me as a person recently in Mexico City, we have a colleague here from the Autonomous University of Mexico City. I was very happy to learn the history of your fantastic university when I was in your city recently, which also grew out of revolution and a repudiation of monarchical, imperialist and colonial universities, which I found fascinating, especially in the light of our one colleague's argument that all universities are born out of revolutions, one of which you're putting on the table is the fourth industrial one, while contemplating what has happened in the last 30 years to those parts of the UN Charter and all the different UN commissions that focus on academic freedom, scientific integrity, the right of people to knowledge and truth. It's clear to me that us human beings are confounding our own ancestors. With every single year that we develop more and more connectedness on this planet, it's no surprise anymore when a professor from the University of Legon in Ghana is working on a project every day with a professor from, let's say, the United Arab Emirates, a professor from the University of Botswana, and say a professor from the Netherlands. This kind of interconnected world of sharing resources has never been as fundamental and exciting as it is today. Every single one of us can name networks of researchers, teachers, pedagogues, sharing curriculum for deep and meaningful learning, drawing out signature pedagogies such as the ones you've shared with us today. And I was just mentioning to our colleague Murray from the University of Columbia that I was reading his university's open source health science curricula with great joy the other day, and comparing and contrasting that to our own medical school curricula. Sharing, online learning, conferences that we all come to in person or online, extraordinary array of global projects. But we've all been striking in this room the other side. Parochialism. Why do we as South Africans constantly focus on our own bellies and our own umbilical cords rather than that of the continent? Asks our colleague quite rightly from Ghana. What about overestimating, in many senses, the openness and sharing between universities when really what we're seeing is a withdrawal globally, evidence particularly acute from the United States, but also very strong from our own region, of huge suspicion about the motives and about the lack of legitimacy and openness in science. All of us cautioned by the United States experience in the last 4 years, but we should not crow at the enormous pain that society is going through around the long and lingering effects of slavery, inequality, and hierarchy. Hierarchies are baked into the ivory tower of universities and institutions all over, and every single one of the authors have attended in some way to that. Pro bono work if we go back to the first speaker, what role does the academician have outside of the academic space? How do we give testimony? How do we speak from a place of confidence? I would like to draw your attention to a short-lived experiment, one that has fascinated me for years. Is there anybody here from the wonderful country of Zambia? Ah, fantastic. You will know, sir, that in the 1960s, as Zambia was moving towards full independence from its colonial master Britain, one of the commitments that the generation, what should we call them, Generation Z #1 of Zambia, was that they would ensure that their young professoriate, the professoriate to be, the future generation, would be exposed to doing their PhDs all over the world. So the first generation of post-colonial Zambians who met the very strict criteria for a funded PhD went global. Unlike most of the universities in Southern Africa, instead of being compelled to do your PhD at a national university in Zambia, whether on the Copperbelt or in Lusaka, you would be encouraged to go and study somewhere else in the world. And furthermore, you would be encouraged to study something other than a Zambian problem, other than a Zambian problematique. You would be encouraged to study in Mandarin an issue around poverty in China, or zoological science in Amsterdam, or a project in Canada. One of my colleagues, Professor Jonas Zeletti, studied revolutionary thinking in Portugal and Canada in comparison. And can you imagine the richness of his experience having done a master's degree in history in his native country? At the end of this massive experiment in learning, in which the whole point was to deparochialize knowledge, to go out as citizens of the world as confident Zambians and meet people from Russia and meet people from Germany and meet people from Egypt as a common human being and bring back this fountain of knowledge to Zambia, as a consequence of the structural adjustment problems and the other huge economic challenges that face Zambia 20 years later. Unfortunately, most of those brilliant Zambian-born people, educated globally, ended up back, unfortunately for Zambia and for South Africa, they ended back in the global north. And they're now the retiring or older professoriate, particularly at universities in the United States and in Europe. And although I'm very sad for Zambia that its economy could not receive back those people as it had intended, I'm absolutely delighted to say that I was privileged to be taught by some of those people in North America. And they have shaped a generation of scientific learning at universities as distinct as Halifax and the University of Utrecht. That was a kind of global experiment from a tiny country whose economy was built on a copper boom which is rising up again and which our cell phones are all filled with now, and upon which our fourth industrial revolution depends. Those old minerals that are still at the basis of how we can proceed. It is true, everybody, that we've had examples given to us today of generosity and sharing, of communities of scholars that we dream of and that we're trying to make. And we've also been given very brief looks into, almost in the case of one presenter, just one slide, of the way in which racism and parochialism and absurd hypotheses which come out of prejudice rather than out of scientific inquiry are still clouding our academy globally. What is the role of young and mid-career scholars in this project? Do you see yourselves, and now as I speak as a nearly 60-year-old woman, I'll ask the question rather than put myself in the room. If we look out over this room, probably about half of us are over the age of 55, maybe 50. What will the new generations of professors and of rising scholars in the world say about keeping the borders of learning open, about removing perverse incentives from research, about staring down the power of corporate greed, about insisting on different perspectives being part of the best of science? Will there be more people of color and black people who make up much more than the majority of the world leading our institutions in 20 years? Will women finally take their equal place? Will questions of sexual harassment and gender violence continue and bullying to bedevil academic institutions from Norway to the Cape? Or will we as scientists and academicians have achieved human rights as the basis of scientific knowledge? There are many questions that remain. I hope I've done a fair job of stitching together at least some of the themes of our 4 presenters, but I do want to end with the very last presentation. It's very painful for many of us, I'm sure, to see the way in which science continues to be yoked to military enterprise and violence. When I was lucky enough to study in the United States, I realized something about South Africa, which I could only see from a distance. When I was in the US, I realized that a lot of my colleagues in engineering and in pure science faculties received their funding from some entity that was attached to the American military complex. I did not realize until I left South Africa and actually looked into this, that so much of South African university life then and now was also underpinned by the particular needs of national governments and their funding decisions around science. I don't believe there's any part of the world where this isn't true. So I do applaud the courage of our young colleague who has actually taken herself as a human rights lawyer and scholar into places of the military. She might make more of a difference in those very difficult spaces than those of us, such as myself, that hide away more inside of the ivory tower. Food for thought around the question of instrumental research. Can you please join me all in thanking our 4, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'd like to first offer the opportunity to our 4 scholars to respond to some of the very challenging questions raised. Maybe we could start over here with you and Academies, and then go that way. And then while we're doing that, can you please think of your other questions, colleagues? Do we have a roving mic here? Yes. And we can just go 1, 2, 3, 4, and address any of the questions that you would like to touch on that were asked. You would, and there was one also to you. Do you remember? Okay, well then we can start with Michael. Then I'll repose the question to you. Okay.
Okay.
Have you got one, Michael?
Yes.
Okay. Michael has a response. Yeah.
Okay, so going back to the question that my colleague from Mexico had regarding distrust in science. So one of the issues is that we've exposed, that I think has been exposed, is that we are foundationally wrong in how we've approached STEM education within the United States. In that we have thought about it entirely in terms of enabling future science and a STEM workforce. And so we go into the issue of why should a scientist be involved in K through 12 education is to go ahead and get more future scientists. If I were to go to a colleague in the history department and say, why should we be teaching history in these classes? They will not tell me so that we can have more PhD historians. They will tell me that it's so that we can have more educated voters. And we are hitting a point where science and an understanding of science impacts so much of what our populations have to make decisions about that's criminally negligent not to, in a sense, not to have educated and to have only focused on the education in science of those who will become future scientists. And this becomes a part, and then furthermore, the lack of incentives once one is a professional scientist to interact with the public. It's been a long-standing problem in American science. Famously, the planetary scientist Carl Sagan, who did brilliant public outreach with a television series called Cosmos, was actually not elected to the National Academies in spite of his foundational scientific achievements, in part because people were so suspicious of the fact that he had a television show. So I think that there's ways in which we have set ourselves up, and we have basically set ourselves up in a way where we would fail under a light rainstorm, and now we're in a hurricane.
Michael, thank you so much. Just before I pass over to you, Mxolisi, Mzukisi put a point to us earlier. He used two metaphors that were really beautiful. One drawn from a scholar at Columbia, and I'm not sure where the other one's drawn from, maybe your own heart, talking about standing on the edge of melting snow, which I think Carl Sagan definitely did. And the second one was seeing around corners. So with those two provocations in mind, I pass over to you to respond to our wonderful colleague from Mexico City, and then I'll come back to the two of you.
Thank you. The question of fake news, we remember during pandemic, as a colleague said it nicely, there were so many fake news around the pandemic itself and how it affects people. Eventually we saw a lot of pharmaceutical companies coming up with the vaccines and so on and so forth. Now, I want to look at the issue of electricity crisis versus fake news around that. It is so difficult to keep fake news in this time and age where everybody is a journalist. Everybody can just write whatever they want on their phones, laptops, and so on and so forth. It is quite difficult. We have laws that are aimed at keeping that, but unfortunately, we will always have fake news. So I think it's up to us, when you receive the news, to verify whether is this genuine or is it fake news. Otherwise, we are drowning on this fake news because they are all over. Whether it's pandemic, whether it's electricity, but the fact remains electricity is a problem in South Africa, and we can say it. As we are here, probably we are running this conference room on life support somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just before I pass over to my two colleagues here, one thought that also occurred to me is that even though most of your life you've worked on quantitative, rigorous scientific paradigms, one of the most powerful parts of your presentation was actually an ethnographic case study that you gave us of people living in Witbank and Middelburg in the middle of a cold climate storm. And so that's also a challenge to those of us from the hard sciences to think about the quite complex array of evidence that we need to make science legitimate and convincing. And it's not only statistical graphs and figures from places like the Pew Foundation that are powerful. They are powerful, of course they are, but also other forms of testimony and case accounts. Let me hand over to you, and then you can pass on the baton.
Thank you very much, Prof. I just want to enter the comment on UCT. I think I'll contextualize this. The point is that certain adverse statements or argument are made in the form of science, right? And therefore, universities and institutions have to be alive, particularly as society constantly is constantly evolving. Not long ago, South Africa, in KZN, there were huge uprising in KZN, looting of some sorts, and we saw people, even politicians, academics, entering those debates, not without any basis. So therefore, we have a role to play in ensuring that science is not used, as to camouflage some of the arguments that are made. I'll stop there. Prof, I hope you're not entering that debate on utilitarian ethics versus virtue ethics. As a lawyer, I would say until people stopped acting virtuously, the law had to step in. But unfortunately, the role of law as we progress has started to diminish because law has eyes. You appear in front of a magistrate, whereas I argue that science can make huge progress by relying on justice. I just want to combine the rest of your question, Prof. I've taken to heart with the one that was made by the colleague at the back. I always wonder, Professor Benz, as to where does the future exist? Where does it reside? Is it tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, next month? I want to argue that sometimes, in most cases, the future exists now. You just have to embrace it. Let me make an example. I'll try to make it 2 examples without taking a lot of time. Mid-2015, universities in South Africa, most universities in South Africa had to navigate what was referred to as the fees must fall. But the main mechanism that university used in order to bridge the gap between classroom and students was online teaching and learning. So the resource was there already. But I can tell you, even now, we just navigating, getting out of COVID. And up until now, there are institutions who are still assessing in January, in July. The picture was very bad in 2020, 2021. Institutions were saying, we're not prepared for this. Whereas the future existed in 2015, but institutions did not embrace it. So I want to quickly go to the next example. I attended a conference in Gqeberha, Port Elizabeth. One of the then director of the Human Rights Commission in South Africa, she said this after the presentation by a certain HOD, Department of Higher Education. She said, I get a bit irritated when I hear in 2023 an assertion being made that majority of female students don't get into university, right? Even the majority of female students that graduate, we don't know what happened after they graduate. She said, I stated this in 2023, but we seem to not have captured the importance of understanding why these students are not, what exactly happens to these students after graduation. I know, our colleagues know I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Law. The majority of the students that we admit are female students. The majority of students that graduates with distinctions are female students. But we don't see them at masters. We don't see them at doctorate. And certainly, the majority of them, we don't see them in employment. What happens? What is the role of science in understanding and providing solution to that? Because the future, if we are to take what the then director said, existed in 2023. It needs not be relegated to tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. We've got to embrace it. Thank you very much.
Yes, I will be brief.
We'll go 4 minutes over, so you've got ample time to address the points that were raised.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much also for the point by my colleague from Ghana. I actually have engaged your military, and I must compliment the high level of female leadership. That is really something to be very, very proud of. So how I see myself, and I think what is very important with the law of armed conflict, the specialization that I do, is that the law applies equally to both parties to the conflict, whether the aggressor or not the aggressor, whether you are the rebel group or the state. So when I engage, I also don't engage as a South African lawyer. because I am not bound by government. I'm an independent academic. So for me, it's very important to have that freedom so that we only look at what international humanitarian law tells us. And sometimes, it is a difficult choice to make because Department of International Relations also pays well, and there are those consultancy opportunities. But you have to always choose, I think, wisely how not to compromise yourself. So when I, for instance, go into the African Union for the first time, it will be as an international humanitarian lawyer and seeing how the laws that we have or how we look at cyber is compliant to the type of law that protects the most vulnerable. So that is indeed very important for me, and I think that we should always remember that neutrality that we need, especially, with things in the news that we see that governments sometimes pronounce on, like not arresting Putin and those things that I personally disagree with. In terms of the questions of who is your audience and different generations, for myself at Future Professor a while ago, we had a whole lecture on the different generations, and I realized that I'm not even a millennial. I was raised by two parents that were born in the 1940s, and my thinking is so influenced by my mom and dad's experience. So I think the lessons is, in terms of knowing your audience, is being aware that students learn in different ways, and there's different influences. How I would teach at the University of Pretoria, where I was a proud member of that faculty before, a lot of my students were, and I am white, I can say it, coming from white privilege. So they have flown on aircraft, they had different experience. So if I would teach them on space law or air law, my approach would be very different from when I engage my students at UJ, which is predominantly black first-generation students. So my message is that we should not have the same script when we go to our classroom. We do not need to change the curriculum. We should just rethink that the very same curriculum. I use the same curriculum at UJ that I use at UP because it's international law. It is the same for all states, right? But depending on that year, even 2-year groups will make an impact of how I deliver my message. So I think I'm speaking to flexibility. Don't change the curriculum, but think about how students will learn. For example, I am hearing impaired, so I learn better visually, right? Well, some students need to see the delivery of the message in a different way, for instance, through sight or audio visual. So let's just open ourselves to meeting them where they are. Then you had a question about SGBV violence and continuing education and UN SDG 4. Are we not only doing lip service, right? So for me, I tend to rather hope to teach my students a methodology because I am still learning. Oh my goodness, the further you progress, the more I know what I don't know. So for me, the value in if I deliver a lecture or a curriculum is to teach them when they are lawyers or they work for the ICRC or they are a soldier, is the methodology of thinking and applying our discipline. Because then learning never stops. Then you have the toolkit that you need to brace all the different changes. And then finally, in terms of research, sometimes we have to do things that makes us uncomfortable, like me sleeping in the barracks with the Czech armed forces. It was eye-opening, I guess, as a learning experience to learn much more when you're uncomfortable, because then you see what happens in the field, and then we can do research what matters. But if we only stay in the safety nets of our desks, then do we really know what is happening on the ground? So that would be my message. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha, and to all of the people for your very thoughtful reflections. We will wrap up now, and I'm going to hand back to Prof. Sudliar. We've asked so many more questions than we've answered today, and we've traveled the whole globe. Certain standouts remain. How do we communicate our scientific knowledge in a way that's respectful and honorable and dignified, but is still critical and engaged? And how do we do it across accent, class, gender, hierarchy, and region? It is to the great credit of ASSAf that they've brought us here together today, along with our colleagues from other learned societies. I'm sure many of you have spent time on the ASSAf website. I think we can be very proud that ASSAf ran an entire journal edition to address the Nikolai Natras project and another one around nutrition of so-called colored women in the Cape. This is an example of science speaking back to and correcting itself, and part of that is due to the outstanding leadership and also moral courage of people like Prof. Sudlia. So I'm very happy to hand back to her. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
No worries. That's Thank you very, very much to the panelists and to Professor Burns for leading us to the most exotic start of a conference one could ever imagine. I mean, I don't know how you do it. Standing on your feet and tying all of this together. I'm just getting comments on my WhatsApp from people online, just in sheer awe of what all of you as a collective have delivered. So thank you ever so much for bringing your heartfelt observations on the topic at hand. And there's nothing better than the lived experience to speak from. And every single one of you have demonstrated that. And I think this is what this meeting is all about. How do we take knowledge that we gather as academics, but utilize the portal of how we live our lives, the intersectionality of the multivariate of what makes up life and society. And I think you all raised it in your individual presentations in more ways than you probably thought about when you started thinking about your presentations. So thank you ever so much for setting this very awesome stage. And I'm sure we're going to delve further into these discussions in the next 2 days. So colleagues, join me on once again applauding our panel and our moderator. So it's my privilege to bring this session to an end. You have some time to stretch your legs and to network and to meet friends, and we will reconvene, I believe, in this room at 6 o'clock for dinner, where we have a very, very, very good keynote speaker in Justice Jody Kolapan, who will address us during that session. So have a little bit of a break, and we welcome you back shortly. Take care.